Welcome everyone. I'm Catherine Renshaw. I'm from the law school at the Australian Catholic University. I've got with me my colleague and friend Nathan Kennedy, who's the president of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, which is an organisation that represents over 3,000 lawyers across Australia. And we welcome you very warmly to tonight's event. I'm particularly glad you're here because it's kind of a big night on the human rights calendar in Sydney tonight. Over there at Sydney Uni, we've got Professor Renshaw talking about the priority of the political over the moral. At UNSW, they're screening a show called Mary Meets Mohammed about a Tasmanian pensioner changing her view about asylum seekers after actually meeting one. And here, of course, we're gathered together to talk about the conflict in Gaza. The conflict needs little description. You've all read the papers. More than 1,800 Palestinians have been killed, 64 Israeli soldiers and 3 Israeli civilians. But as we meet here tonight, the ceasefire in Gaza is holding, and negotiators for the Israelis and the Palestinians are speaking to one another through Egyptian authorities. But at the same time, the UN Human Rights Council has appointed an independent commission to investigate allegations of war crimes committed by both sides to the conflict. Reaction to the events in Gaza has been impassioned. We saw 100,000 people marching in the streets of London, tens of thousands marching in Cape Town, and on the streets of Spain and France, and here in Sydney as well. The response has not only been impassioned, but it's been ugly at times as well. In Germany and France, synagogues have been vandalised, and so have Jewish stores. Australia hasn't escaped this ugliness. What Mike Carlton wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald, the responses to that came through email and Twitter, his response to those responses, his resignation. All of this confirmed in many of us a deep sense of despair that this was the sort of language we're using to describe this conflict here in Australia with all of our liberty and democracy and freedom. So, Nathan and Jara and I organised tonight thinking that if academics and if organisations like Australian Lawyers for Human Rights had any value whatsoever, it's because they were able to provide a third kind of forum. Beyond the quick responses of the media and the Twitter sphere, and beyond the slogans of street marches, it was a forum for reasoned debate where different opinions make you search for deeper truths rather than heightened conflict. So that's what we've done tonight. And we have 3 excellent speakers to guide us through the complexities of this conflict. On international law, Dr. Emily Crawford, who's a lecturer at the University of Sydney and co-director of the Sydney Centre for International Law. She was previously at the law faculty at the University of New South Wales. She worked as a researcher at the ABC. Her PhD thesis was published by Oxford University Press in 2010. So she teaches international law, researches international law. She trains military personnel on behalf of the Red Cross in Australia. And currently she's looking at the conduct of armed conflict in the 21st century, things like cyber warfare, targeted assassinations. To discuss the geopolitical aspects of the conflict, we have Dr. Anthony Billingsley from the International Relations Department at the School of Social Sciences in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at UNSW. Anthony's main research focus is the Middle East and international law, including political succession in the Arab world, constitutions and law in the region, and the politics of the Gulf, Syria and Egypt. Finally, Peter Slezak, an associate professor in the School of Humanities and Languages at the University of New South Wales. Peter teaches on science, philosophy, religion, politics, and the interrelationship of all of them. He writes a lot and widely in a range of forums. And a couple of weeks ago, I came across something that Peter wrote in an online forum that stayed with me. He said, when patriotic tribal passions are at their height as now, It's undoubtedly the hardest but the most important time to pause in the name of our common humanity, to reflect honestly on the causes and possible solutions to the tragedy that's engulfing Israel and Palestine. And then he quoted Bertrand Russell: "We're never as noble and our enemies are never as evil as we like to think," which is a good note on which to begin and also hopefully to end tonight's conversation. So we'll begin with Peter himself.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Thanks very much for inviting me along here. It's a great privilege to come in exactly this kind of context, to have a chance to speak about these things from a perspective which is not quite as a professional academic that researches in these areas. So I'm very grateful for the chance to talk to you a little bit. I've got a special angle which I'll indicate as I go along, and I didn't know Catherine was going to quote that passage. That was actually published in the Jewish Online press, and you may know I'm Jewish, and it is relevant for me to try to create some kind of bridge in what is a very difficult dialogue to have, and that's why this is a very nice occasion. I'm very grateful for the chance to talk here. So the only apology I make is I've always got too many slides, and they're largely to prompt me, so forgive me if I'm going to skip through some, but I need the slides to help me just go through some of the things I want to say, help structure what I want to talk about. There's three sections to the talk. I'll try and fit into the short time available. I want to put my talk into a context. I want to indicate the kind of talk I want to give and the slightly unusual nature of it. And of course, my brief has been to talk about the history of this conflict, which is kind of impossible in 15 minutes. It's impossible in a lot longer. But I'll make a gesture towards that in some ways, and of course focus specifically on Gaza. So let me indicate the background. Now, I just put together, not quite at random, but a bunch of the headings that one would address if you had longer to talk about the key issues that arise in Gaza. I'll try and say something a little bit about them, but obviously it's impossible in 15 minutes to really be serious about this. I do want to say some things about them for reasons I'll indicate, but so I want to indicate the obstacles to talking about history. I'm not a professional historian, but I want to indicate to you one of my themes is how those of us who are not professionals need to engage with these sorts of issues. You'll see something I want to say about that. The problem I want to address is a more serious and important obstacle. History is very ideological. It's not just an academic enterprise. Even as I'm talking to Anthony and others, archaeology has become very political. So I need to talk a little bit about how we try to grapple with the difficulties in understanding history in this kind of political and ideological context. And of course the central question is the hot topic and the difficulty of balance and detachment, and in particular what I want to talk about is responsibility. The responsibility we all have as human beings, not just as academics and citizens. Now, so what I want to indicate is, in the time available, I want to approach, philosophers like to talk about ascending to a meta level. When you've got a very difficult dispute, you can keep, as I often do, you can imagine I have a lot of arguments with people, among Jewish friends, the ones that still talk to me. And the difficulty is that you start just swapping facts and things that you think are relevant. And when a debate is very difficult like that, a very useful strategy is to ask questions about the nature of the dispute, to ascend to a meta level. So instead of talking about history, so to speak, as I would hear if we had longer, part of what I want to talk about is how we talk about the history. So it's to do with trying to understand the source of the dispute and the nature of the dispute, which is a little bit easier to talk about because we may be able to agree about that, you see, and then you can get back to the substantive issues. So although the time is limited, that's a strategy I want to approach. I can't help raising this question, given my particular position here. It's this interesting question of the contrast or the border or the line between being an academic and an activist. It's no secret that I'm active with other advocates and activists for Palestinian human rights. And the question I want to raise is where that fits into one's role as an academic, as a citizen. And of course there's these wonderful quotes that are relevant. The Pericles' funeral oration, "For we alone regard someone who takes no part in politics, not as someone who sticks to his own business, but as a man who's good for nothing." And I rather prefer Eldridge Cleaver, the black activist, who said, "You're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem." And I think that's an important insight. So that's the kind of context in which I want to put it. Now, inevitably, some people who know me well know I can't go for more than about 10 minutes without mentioning Chomsky's name. I teach his linguistics and he's an important influence. But in this case, I go back to what I think is an enormously important and relevant writings that he made in the 60s in the Vietnam period. It's to do with the responsibility of intellectuals. These were very eloquent, very powerful essays which put him on the world stage as a force and a dissident in regard to foreign policy and so on. And so the most I can do is make these hints. I won't be able to give you my full-blown kind of account of Chomsky and his views, but I do want to indicate those, because what I can do in 15 minutes is to just gesture in certain directions at certain ideas that I think are important to help us in approaching these difficult questions. One of the things he said was that a fact that must colour any discussion of contemporary American institutions, but of course it applies to our own in this context. The level of culture that can be achieved in the United States is a life and death matter for large masses of suffering humanity. He means by this the extent to which we can intellectually deal with the very difficult problems that we're talking about, especially in this context. So that's kind of a guide for why I think these are interesting and important questions. I mean, I haven't got time to go into it all, but I rather like Picasso's take on this. He says, painting is not done to decorate apartments, an instrument of war for attack and defence against the enemy. Well, that's rather bold, but I think there's something there about what teaching and academic life also has. It's not necessarily an instrument, but it's something to help us think about these problems. Now, that's the sort of scenes that we've been seeing, and it's in that context I'm concerned with responding to these issues, not only in an intellectual way, but in a human way. And that's part of the difficulty. There's a level of difficulty in addressing what I take to be what Chomsky's concerns were, and I'll come back to these at the end. The difficulty of responding in what I take to be the important human response to overwhelming catastrophe. And the problem in relation to history is that there are very deep divisions, as we say, contested narratives. I don't like the word narrative especially, but people use that. It's too postmodern for me. But I mean, it's the idea that there are very serious disputes, and I put these up as a shorthand to show you that on the one hand you get people like Alan Dershowitz, on the other hand people like Chomsky, not least of all, and Finkelstein, who give you completely different views of what the story, what the history is, what the facts are, then and now, going back to 48. This is the problem I'm trying to raise as a concern for us to think about. I can't do it justice, obviously, but I'm trying to raise now what is the difficulty and how we might approach adjudicating or coming to some decision about where the truth lies when the history is so contested. So this is really a difficult issue. One of the things to say is that in the dispute, and the sources aren't always used, there's an enormous amount of human rights organisations, enormous number, B'Tselem and a whole bunch of organisations. I put this list up because they're not the ones that are usually cited by partisans on, let's say, the Israeli side, the Jewish sources, the Zionist narrative. But some of them, like B'Tselem, are Israeli human rights organisations. So my concern is, pretty obvious, I'm not pretending to present a balanced picture. I'm a partisan on one side of this dispute, that's clear. But I'm pointing to the ways in which one might address this with people who disagree. So these are relevant sources, and I'm going to talk about the media. Now, one of the interesting things about the history is that the history reached a kind of a turning point when the official story, some people refer to as the Leon Uris Exodus account, you know, the book and the novel, it became challenged, and let me put it to you in perhaps a more dramatic way. There's an Israeli called Miko Peled, who's the son of a very famous general, Matityahu Peled, from the 1967 war. And without going into the long story, his sister had a child blown up in a suicide bomb. And at some point when he talks about this, he says it was very difficult for him to come to the realization, after he was an adult, that everything he knew, or thought he knew about the whole conflict was wrong. That's a shorthand coming from somebody to indicate the difficulty. I'm not really trying to convince you of anything here tonight. I'm trying to indicate somebody in that position is saying that everything we think is mistaken. I know from my personal experience it's very hard to have a conversation when that's the case. I mean, nobody, including me, would find it, we would all find it very difficult to deal with that. But that's what I'm saying is the difficulty. Now, in this case, Ilan Pappé, who's an Israeli historian, writes this, what you might call revisionist history of the whole story of 1948. He uses the word ethnic cleansing, meaning literally, and gives an account, a legal kind of definition based on Kosovo or wherever the term first became used. There are disputes among those new historians. Benny Morris has got a slightly different account, and they dispute whether the things that went on in 48 were born of war or born of design. I won't go into all this again. I'm just gesturing at the kinds of historical issues and the debates that are going on that we have to take seriously and we need to engage with. One of the difficulties, of course, is it takes an enormous amount of time. It takes a lot of effort, and most people can't do it seriously, so it's a difficult problem to debate these questions. I won't go on, I'm going to skip over stuff, but there's a lot of references to the question of the role of intellectuals. There's a famous book by Julien Blandard, which was called, the English translation, The Treason of Intellectuals. And Orwell is very interesting in this. In that genre, in that tradition, I'll have to read the quote because I'm worried I'm going to run out of time, but I need to slow down a little bit. He says something very important for all of us. He's writing, this was a suppressed preface to Animal Farm. It was only published not that long ago. It was interesting, it was suppressed. He says the servility with which the greater part of the British intelligentsia have swallowed and repeated in those days Russian propaganda would be quite astounding if it were not that they have behaved similarly on several earlier occasions. On one controversial issue after another, the Russian viewpoint has been accepted without examination and then publicised with complete disregard to historical truth or intellectual decency. It's a very interesting remark. And he says, the intelligentsia have been more wrong about the progress of the war than the common people, and that they were more swayed by partisan feeling. He's talking about us. That's the point. He says they had complete disregard for historical truth or intellectual decency and becoming voluntary agents of state power. He said he has a facility to look in the mirror. That's a difficult problem, to face our own culpability, our own responsibilities. And he has a lovely remark at the bottom there. He says, one has to belong to the intelligentsia to believe things like that. No ordinary man could be such a fool. It's kind of a cute remark. Now, of course, again, I won't have time to do all these slides properly. I apologise for that in a bit, but I wanted to just signal Chomsky's entire writing, the entire corpus of political writing since the 60s has been on that theme. He says that the worst propagandists, and in fact victims of propaganda, who do it out of conviction, are the educated. He says that education is an institution that cultivates conformity. You're rewarded for conformity. And we like to think of us, that we're educated people, that we think independently. Now, again, I can't make the case. I'm signalling some important ideas that I think we need to think about and to read. And the quote at the bottom of there, he says, well, I'll just read at the top. I can't resist reading the bits he says. He wrote of the intellectuals who can be counted on in significant measure to provide the ideological justification for such barbarism as the US assault on the rural population of Cambodia, Laos, East Timor. You can pick other conflicts where he's been very important in his writings, as he has been in Israel-Palestine, extensive, detailed, scholarly writings. He wrote of the natural tendency of significant segments of the intellectual community to offer their allegiance not to truth and justice, but to power and the effective exercise of power. And he says it's frightening to observe the comparative indifference of American and other intellectuals to the actions of their government and so on. You get the idea. I've got lots more about education, and I'm going to skip over it. But he does say that insofar as the role of intellectuals as dispassionate critics has been lost, what we have to learn is intellectual self-defense, how to resist and learn to see through the mystification that we're subject to, the enormous propaganda that is very hard to extricate yourself from, partly because it takes a lot of work. And so that's the issue. I better just go through all of this stuff. But he wrote extensive scholarly works on what look like, at first sight, and some of his critics misunderstand them, they look like the histories of East Timor or Latin America he wrote a lot about, or Southeast Asia. It's a misunderstanding. He's actually writing about us. What he's writing about is the way in which the well-known, uncontroversial information that you can read in official documents from the Pentagon or where he reads them all. He read the whole of the Pentagon papers. You know, nobody on earth has done that. And he shows how the available facts are filtered through, as he says, the intellectual culture and the media. Now, this is an interesting exercise. When you look at books like The Manufacturing Consent, he goes through case studies. The East Timor case is a very important one. How it's hard for us to believe that, as I said in the case of Miko Peled, that everything we think could be so different. But when you look at cases, and here's the method I always recommend to people, pick a case where you don't have a stake. If you're Jewish and you care about Israel-Palestine, it's going to be very hard. Pick East Timor where you don't really kind of feel like you've got a side. Pretend you're a Martian. And then it's a lot easier and you can see more clearly. And so Chomsky does these paired case studies in lots of cases that are very revealing. Okay, well, let me see if I can do it. How am I going for time, by the way? I'm completely lost track. I've hardly got to the slides. Well, I'm going to zip through. I've got slides here from Ben Gurion that indicate, this is now the prehistory. I was going to say that you can't talk about Gaza. I probably won't even get to Gaza. You can't talk about Gaza without looking at the history. I'll just do this without the slides. The slides will just keep me going for too long. The story of Gaza is part of the story of Palestine and how it became Israel, a large part of it. You can't separate that out. Gaza is an integral part of Palestine and can't be separated, although the Israelis want that to separate out. So that's part of the difficulty. I'm going to just skip forward. I was looking at the migration. I can't believe I've got so many slides. I also was going to show you what Begin and his party, this is from the New York Times in 1948, I wish I had time to read to you how it was described, a signature by Einstein and others who were already outraged at what they described as the fascism and the religious fanaticism, things which are just overwhelmingly clear today, but they were already very clear back then. That's the kind of background. The villages that were depopulated, there's a long story. So let me jump ahead to Gaza quickly. Oh, here's a summary, by the way. I often use this as a guide. This is a poster that's been around in public to show what happened. This is the short version of the history. You know, the successive occupation, and Gaza is left in the corner there. Now, there's a lot to say about what happened. Let me just do something about Gaza before I wind up. Perhaps the best thing I can do is tell you something to read. I'll have to save some of this for question time. Sarah Roy is a Jewish woman, daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she's the world's perhaps leading political economist and expert on Gaza. She spent a lot of time there, and there's several books, but this is one of the most important on Hamas and the misleading stories about Hamas and Gaza that everybody I talk to, I've got friends that are diplomats, I was talking about some of these people, Hamas is demonized to a degree that you'd be surprised how different the story is. For example, they've made repeated attempts and serious offers to negotiate peace. They're not described that way. The question of terrorism, this is all misleading, and it's important to see that there are sources about that. So I'm going to just skip through my slides in case there's one or two things I really want to say. Gaza is under the most appalling blockade before they were attacked, both in 2008 and now. One of the things I should say, just while I'm thinking, I've only got a few minutes left. Look, one of the central things I was going to show you as a guide to the misinformation was this slide. This was actually, since I've shown you now, the question of rockets. I better say one thing that really I want to say about Gaza, about the misinformation. The one dominant narrative, I suppose you say, or the information was that Israel is responding to rockets. It's a lie. And the lie, when I said, I mean, I've been to Canberra and I'm privileged to go on delegations lobbying with federal ministers, and I was asked by the Foreign Minister, Stephen Smith, at the time when he was Foreign Minister, he said, how do we know? I said, you look on the Israeli government's Foreign Affairs website, they had a graph. This tells you the whole story. They took it down, you can still find the information, somebody captured it off the screen. In June 2008, there was a peace agreement, a ceasefire agreement with Hamas. They observed it, despite the fact that the blockade was not lifted as was required under the conditions. There were no rockets. The few that are there were actually fringe groups. They weren't Hamas rockets, but there were essentially no rockets until Israel violated the ceasefire in November the 4th of 2008. Now, that's a case where we know pretty much what happened. And then, of course, the rockets came, and the entire rhetoric, foreign ministers, politicians, media, completely misrepresented the realities that are not hard to find. I probably should wind up in a minute, so I'll just indicate on this time as well. If you go to the trouble to look at the timeline of what happened this time, the first thing to say is that Israel is killing people in Gaza and in the West Bank repeatedly. In the West Bank, 2 kids every week on average have been killed. So the idea that history began with the rockets is just a fraud and it's misleading. Now, I'm suggesting that you check this because I'm suggesting it makes a big difference to how we understand what is the almost overwhelming consensus on what the problem is. Now, because I'm saying it doesn't make it true, but I'm indicating there are serious, and you can read about Hamas and so on in reputable sources, including Israel's Haaretz, where this alternative narrative has been. Let me go to the end. I've been to Gaza and I've just got a few pictures here that I was going to show and talk about them. Let me go to the very end, another minute or two. The New York Times, for example, represents what's going on there in a kind of a regular update. And it indicates, but it's extremely misleading. On the one hand, the targets that are struck by Israel, and then sort of roughly comparable figure about the number of rockets launched. Well, if you look at what's going on there, I mean, here's a picture of the damage that one rocket did. And here's the damage that one, I don't know what it was, blew up the whole building down. So this is the kind of contrast that is important. You're probably aware of it. Let me wind up. I'll go right to the very end. A lot of the rhetoric about Palestinians has been discussed by Edward Said, one of the great heroes, and who spoke very eloquently about the extent of anti-Muslim, anti-Arab racism in our media, going back to 1981 when he wrote a book called Covering Islam. Leading intellectuals have really reversed this and pretended that you know, it's the Muslims around the world that are eye deep in red barbarity, and their intuitions are not as great as ours. I want to show you and wind up on this. This was a game that is now online somewhere. Bomb Gaza. And you can bomb targets in Gaza, which are civilian targets or whatever, with Hamas hiding in there. And the reason I mention this is because it goes back to something Chomsky wrote in the Vietnam period. I remembered it, and it's striking how this revisits that. There was a game during the Vietnam period where kids in a supermarket, not computer games, just could do some kind of shooting at Vietnamese peasants in villages. And he was horrified by that. And he wrote, I asked the question, who's the victim of delusional thinking or poisoned faculties? But he referred in the second paragraph there to the moral degeneration, which is on such a scale that we have to ask ourselves whether what is needed is dissent or denazification. This is a very serious point. It sounds like it's an exaggeration, but he was deeply concerned about the moral degeneration that we're facing in the face of the most horrible crimes. And he answers, and I'll end on that. He says, what is more, there's no powerful outside force that can tell us to account. The change will have to come from within. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Just close it.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's, as Peter said, it is an interesting opportunity for those of us who spend our time in classes to talk to a different sort of group. I'm going to adopt perhaps the line that Mr. Chomsky would not approve of, which is a much more sort of down the middle approach, partly because of being a diplomat for 20 years sort of warps your faculties to an extent, but also because I think there is an element of the need to understand, not approve, but understand the different perspectives. And so I want to touch on that to an extent. Just to follow up on one point that Peter made right towards the end on the New York Times, and I think we can see now the counterattack coming. So we have an article that in the New York Times where the definition of what constitutes an adult is being questioned, and so now anyone, a male over the age of 15, is now regarded as an adult and targetable. It occurred to me at one stage that when I was preparing for this, that maybe the title of the session should be called Gaza, Israel, Here We Go Again. In 2009, I contributed a chapter to a book edited by Ray Gator called Gaza, Morality, Law and Politics. And my chapter was on the UN Human Rights Council's fact-finding mission into the just finished conflict. And of course that mission produced what a report that later became known as the Goldstone Report. A report that has generated vast controversy even before it was released or complete. My focus in the chapter was to look at some of the more political rather than legal aspects of Goldstone, and in particular the implication that people were drawing from, and I think should have drawn from Goldstone, that Israeli behaviour over Gaza was in fact no better than the behaviour of the people they were attacking. And I think this really drove deeply into Israeli psyche. There were lots of Israeli politicians and others saying this is a sword hanging over our heads and it's going to hang over our heads for a long time. And I think that is a correct assessment. The other thing that Goldstone reported was that the actions, the things that happened in Gaza in 2008, 2009 was the result of policy, not of a bunch of soldiers who were out of control or not properly trained. This, of course, is one of the things that Goldstone personally tried to wriggle out from underneath with his so-called retraction. Now, as I say, here we go again. And on the 23rd of July, the Human Rights Council decided to set up yet another commission of inquiry to look at and they learnt their lesson from the first time, to look at violations of international humanitarian and human rights law by both sides. I fear, well, I think it is inevitable that this new commission is going to be looking at exactly the same problems that we looked at in 2009. Israel's assault on Gaza has been roundly criticised by the United States administration, by the UN Secretary General, by European leaders, even by the Australian Foreign Minister. Human Rights Watch has complained to the US administration that Israel is violating US law by using materiel provided under certain conditions. The British government has now announced that it is going to refuse to allow sales of military materiel to Israel if fighting resumes, because of the same sort of concern. And I think this is totally appropriate. I regard what has been going on as the Americans said, indefensible. But as I said, to make sense of this, I really think it is important to try to understand the position, the context in which Israel is looking at Gaza and the relationship, the very fraught relationship between Israel and the Palestinians more generally over time. As I said, it's not to excuse the attacks on schools and UN facilities and that sort of thing, but to try to appreciate Israel's lasting sense of insecurity and as I said, this sort of difficult relationship, whether it's guilt or whatever, that Israelis have with Palestinians. A point that Peter sort of touched on briefly, the conflict did not start, as I think the media would have us believe, with the killing of those 4 young Israeli settlers, or the revenge murder of the Palestinian lad. There is pretty strong evidence that in fact the killings were carried out by, well, people perhaps associated with Islamic State. But of course Israelis went after Hamas. It's not the first time they've gone after Hamas knowing that Hamas was not guilty. What's driving that, I think, are very deep issues in the relationship between the two sides. In part, it is based on the confrontational approach that Hamas has adopted towards Israel. Its charter, which Peter had on one of his flash-by slides, talks about jihad. Now, that can be ambiguous, but the way it's described in the charter would suggest that they're looking at the lesser jihad, the violent one. And they're talking about reclaiming all Palestinian land lost to Jews. Also there, I think, is the extraordinary frustration and sense of isolation that Gazans feel as a result of the Israeli blockade. I spent nearly a month in Israel-Palestine last year, and the feeling, the intensity of the frustration that's associated. I mean, there is a physical problem, of course, as well, but just the emotional impact of that blockade is, I think, really, really important to consider. And I think the other aspect about this relationship is that Israel itself is still going through an unresolved debate about the nature of the society. Israelis still don't know what they particularly expect their country to be. There are, for people of my vintage, I suppose, well, maybe not the Leon Uris model, but this idea of the sort of plucky underdog, slightly socialist state. And then you have the religious tensions increasing, especially around Jerusalem. So there's all sorts of issues there, even just affecting the nature of Israel. Hamas has long rejected, ostensibly, and again I agree with Peter about how this is not actually the full story, but has rejected attempts to negotiate a settlement in the Israel-Palestine issue. And that's consistent with its charter. And it has resorted to very violent means. Much of the violence during the Second Intifada came from Gaza. Despite the wall going down along the West Bank, the violence was coming, a lot of it, from the south. And the rockets, impotent though they are, I mean, they are very small, militarily insignificant things, still have the capacity to remind people of the potential for violence that's coming from there. And we saw a couple of missiles, rockets, landing near Ben Gurion Airport, and the impact was significant. American flights stopping, some European flights stopping. So it isn't, I think, surprising that Israelis and Israel as a government struggle to trust Hamas. It also, I suspect, helps to explain to a point, certainly not to excuse, why many Israelis have a very unpalatable attitude to Palestinians. Why they tend to regard, many of them, regard them as less than human. In Jerusalem, I was wandering around and there was a big bit of graffiti on the wall which said, "Gas the Arabs." Now, to me, I found that the most extraordinary thing to see in that particular context. Now, having said that, there are hard political considerations behind all of this, behind Israel's approach to Gaza. The isolation of Gaza, I think, is very important in Israel's response to demands for a negotiated settlement with Palestine, with Palestinians. As far as I'm concerned, since Rabin, at least, no Israeli government, no Israeli Prime Minister has seriously considered negotiations that might lead to a Palestinian state. Now, the Hamas Charter is held up as one of the reasons why you can't negotiate with that part of Palestine. However, that particular position runs in face of, and Peter again had on one of his slides, the Likud Charter, which says that the Jordan River shall remain the permanent border of Israel. Jerusalem will not be divided, and especially not with the Palestinians, and the government of Israel flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. I think it was about 2 weeks into this crisis, and Netanyahu told an audience in Israel that he is really pleased now that Israelis are coming to accept the view that he has been pursuing for a very long time, that there must not be a Palestinian state. In 2004, just before Israel withdrew unilaterally from the Gaza Strip, Dov Weissglass, who was a senior advisor to Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister, explained the intention behind the withdrawal. I'll just read this very quickly. The reason was the freezing of the peace process, and when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package called the Palestinian state and all that it entails has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. And all this with a US presidential blessing and the ratification of both houses of Congress. And I probably won't have time, but I'd love to have a go at the international community in this particular context. The disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. So we have the strategy of isolation enforcing and supporting this policy of not seriously negotiating. Israel does argue that there's no point negotiating with Mahmoud Abbas, nice man though he is, he doesn't speak for the Palestinians. Hence its anger over the unification government that was created, whereby Abbas is able now, ostensibly anyway, to say that he does represent all Palestinians. Also their anger with the United States, because of course the US blamed, well, first of all supported the idea of a unity government and blamed Israel for the breakdown of the negotiations that Kerry had been engaged in. And of course Israeli anger on that score is that it is aggravated by the knowledge that the US has been complicit in Israeli tactics up until this point. It would seem to me that Hamas was prepared militarily, strategically, and psychologically for this latest round of fighting. The group had, as we all know now, its elaborate tunnel network, which of course the Israelis knew about a long while before, and a significant store of weapons. It was very keenly aware of the desperate mood of the population, and I think was quite in touch with the views of the population. For Hamas, an extended conflict that still left the organisation intact was perhaps the only way left to it and to the people of Gaza to attract the attention of the rest of the international community. I'm not sure how successful that has been. If you look at the response of Arab governments, for example, silence. But I think that was what their intention was. The only way to break out of the slow death of the blockade. And I think that's why, because there was a lot of provocation in Hamas actions. Put aside their rejection of the first peace proposal because that was intended to force them to reject it, but subsequent actions perhaps. For Netanyahu, the fighting, I think, presented, how am I going? Right. Presented a less than positive prospect with the potential to add further damage to a reputation for the country that was already on the skids, and to his own domestic standing, which is shaky. Now, no government could tolerate or survive missiles landing on its territory, so he had to do something. But the extremists on Netanyahu's right, people like Lieberman, people like Bennett, were determined to force the Prime Minister's hand and to drive Israeli troops into Gaza. They were going around the country accusing him of cowardice. And so we have the domestic consideration running into Israeli actions as well. I'd like to end on a positive note, but I can't. But I'm not very hopeful of the prospects for peace, at least, with the people that we have on the ground at the moment. I think seeing Israel conducting long-term, I mean, we've had negotiations going on now for a number of days, which is, I think, really, really interesting, especially with the United States not being engaged. And that must be positive. Jaw is better than war, as the great man once said. Nevertheless, it is very hard to see how these negotiations can actually deal with something that is more than a stopgap. Yes, we can stop the fighting at the moment, and the Europeans can throw the money back into Gaza, and Gaza can rebuild until the next time of mowing the lawn. And so I fear that, beyond, in this particular context, we're going to be disappointed if we're looking for something more substantial. I'll stop there.
You don't have to stick, of course.
I think I'm going to be a bit of an anomaly tonight, both as an academic and as a lawyer. I'm going to go under time, I believe. I think I deserve a prize for that, Catherine. I expect something later. So we've heard a little bit about some of the history, and certainly the philosophical issues about history, and also the politics surrounding the current conflict in Gaza. So my part of this triumvirate is to take you through some of the international law issues that have arisen regarding the events over the past few weeks. And so before I delve into the specifics, I want to give you a little bit about the relevant framework of the law of armed conflict, otherwise known as international humanitarian law, or IHL for short. But before we even get to that point, I need to make an initial point about one of the fundamental tenets of international law, and certainly one of the foundational tenets of the UN Charter, is that states are not to use force or the threat of force in their international relations with one another. Now, there are certain allowable exceptions, for instance, the right of a state to use force in self-defence against an armed attack. But the reason why I mention that is I'm actually not going to talk about the use of force issues that have been raised here, but why that's relevant for international humanitarian law is that the application of IHL is not contingent on following the rules on the use of force. So a state or a non-state party that acts in violation on the law of the use of force does not lose the right to be protected under IHL. So a state that's been attacked contrary to international law is not absolved of its obligations to follow IHL if war results. They can't say, well, they didn't follow the rules in attacking us, so therefore we don't have to follow the rules in response. The idea is that IHL is meant to be universally applicable, regardless of the, inverted commas, rightness or wrongness of either side's motivations. So once a certain threshold of violence is met, IHL applies to all of the parties to a conflict, regardless on whether the law on the use of force has been observed. This is a principle known as the equality of belligerents, and it reflects what has really come to be the fundamental humanitarian nature of the modern law of armed conflict. And that is based on this idea that it is the job of IHL to protect civilians and to protect those people who are not or who are no longer taking direct part in hostilities. The law is designed to protect them from the deleterious effects of armed conflict. So I'm now going to move on to the kind of substantial rules in IHL that have been applicable. And the foundational rule of IHL is the idea that parties to the conflict must distinguish between civilians who take no part in the hostilities and anyone who takes direct part in the hostilities, whether they are soldiers as part of the regular armed forces or whether they are anyone else who takes up arms to take direct part in the hostilities and commit hostile acts. This is known in the law as the principle of distinction. And one of the primary means with which this obligation is fulfilled is through the prohibition on targeting civilians. And it's contained in Article 48 of Additional Protocol 1, protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. It states that parties to the conflict are to only direct attacks against military objectives. Now, the principle of distinction is also fundamental and it underpins all the rules on targeting that are contained in IHL. So Article 51 of Protocol 1 says that civilians are not to be made the object of attack. Civilian objects like schools, religious buildings, hospitals, private residences and so on are also not to be attacked. And that parties to the conflict must, when possible, warn civilians of impending attacks in order to give them time to evacuate. And there are a couple of other obligations that flow on from this. So parties to an armed conflict must also ensure that when they launch attacks, they don't use munitions that cannot be directed at specific targets. So Article 51, paragraph 4 of Protocol 1 calls these kinds of attacks indiscriminate attacks. And they are prohibited, and they describe indiscriminate attacks as those which are not directed at a specific military objective, those which employ a method or means of combat which cannot be directed at a specific military objective, or those which employ a method or means of combat, the effects of which cannot be limited, and are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilians or civilian objects without distinction. So, for instance, the practice of carpet bombing an area would be considered an indiscriminate attack, or using unguided munitions or dumb weaponry, as it's sometimes colloquially called, would be an example of an indiscriminate attack. Finally, and to kind of round it out, parties to a conflict must not also engage in what's known as disproportionate attacks. And they are defined as an attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So what I hope you can see from these provisions is IHL doesn't forbid people from targeting objects. It just forbids certain objects from being targeted, and even military objectives may not be targeted if the result is going to be disproportionate on the civilian population. Now, the other side of this is that the principle of distinction doesn't just place rules on parties to the conflict in attack. There are also obligations on those who are taking defensive measures. So parties to the conflict must, as far as practicable, avoid placing military objectives in civilian areas. They must not use civilians or civilian installations like schools or hospitals as a way to kind of immunise them from being attacked. So The most obvious way is that parties to a conflict shouldn't use civilian installations for military purposes. So you shouldn't store munitions in schools. You shouldn't use mosques or churches or synagogues to launch attacks. Now, as with all things in law, there are always exceptions, there are always provisos. And all of these rules are limited by a very specific proviso, which is namely that a civilian or a civilian object will lose its immunity from being targeted if it can be considered as having a military purpose. So for civilians, if they take direct part in the hostilities, they can be targeted for as long as they take direct part. They basically temporarily lose their civilian immunity. And in the same way, a civilian object can also be targeted if it's used in a way that will render it a military objective. So for example, as I said, if a school is used as a launching site for rocket attacks. Now, the qualifier here is that Israel is not a party to Protocol 1, but it is a party to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. Palestine has this year acceded to both the Geneva Conventions and to Additional Protocol 1. That being said, many of the provisions of Additional Protocol 1 are considered as being declaratory of customary international law. And for the non-lawyers in the room, that means they apply to everyone regardless of whether or not you've signed on to the treaty. So when I speak about Additional Protocol 1, even though Israel is not a party, the idea is that as customary international law, these provisions apply to them as well. So with this legal framework in mind, I'm going to move now to look at some of the events that have happened in Gaza over the last month and look at the problems that they raise under IHL. Now, the first issue that obviously comes up is in regards to attacks against civilians. Now, as I've mentioned, deliberately targeting civilians who are not taking direct part in the hostilities is a violation of IHL, and it's considered a war crime under international law. Parties to an armed conflict must ensure they neither deliberately nor negligently target civilians or civilian installations, nor use civilian installations in such a manner as to render them liable for targeting. Now, unfortunately, evidence over the past month has indicated that both sides in this fight have engaged in this behaviour. There is evidence to suggest that the IDF have used non-precision artillery in densely populated residential areas, which likely will put them on the wrong side of the rules on indiscriminate attacks and disproportionate attacks. And Hamas have also been criticised, and there is evidence to suggest that they have been directing rockets indiscriminately at Israel, resulting in civilian deaths. Evidence has also unfortunately suggested that Hamas has used civilian structures for military purposes. The UN Relief and Works Agency has stated that rockets and other munitions were found in one of its abandoned schools. And journalists and religious personnel have actually gone on the record as saying they have witnessed rocket attacks being launched within Gaza from schools, from hospitals, and in one instance from a Greek Orthodox church. So as I pointed out, when a civilian takes direct part in hostilities or when a civilian object is used for military purposes, their civilian immunity from attack is lost for as long as the person or object is deemed to have a military function. Now, the big problem here is how you define direct participation in hostilities. Now, the wording in Additional Protocol 1 puts it thus: civilians shall enjoy protection from attack unless and for such time as they take direct part in hostilities. Now, there are a number of key terms to define in that sentence. IHL takes a very broad approach as to who can be classified as a civilian. Basically, it's everyone who isn't a member of the armed forces or regular armed units, as defined by the Geneva Conventions. Basically, you need to be part of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, as they would understand it. That part of the phrase is essentially uncontroversial. But what about the term "for such time"? When does direct participation begin and end? And the term direct part is also hugely complicated. What kind of acts amount to direct participation? I mean, firing a weapon is an obvious example of direct participation, but there are whole degrees of participation short of that. And the hard thing is trying to figure out, well, when do you actually cross that line? Is transporting weaponry considered to be direct participation? What if you're acting in a support role? You never see combat, but you might be providing food or shelter to people who might be taking direct part. Other problematic activity in Gaza has been seen with often conflicting reports regarding the use of human shields and the effectiveness of evacuation warnings. Now, prior to any strike, the IDF warned civilians in the area that an attack is imminent and that they should evacuate. And they've done this through a number of means. They send text messages, there have been phone calls, there have been leaflet drops. Now, there has been evidence from Gaza that has shown that while some indeed evacuate the area, others stay. Now, the reasons have varied. And again, this is a highly contested area and reports are hugely conflicting. Now, some have said that it's because these people have either been forced or chosen to be voluntary human shields. Others have said it's because there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to evacuate that is safe in Gaza. And if it's conflicting, if you're getting conflicting reports from the media, it gets even worse when you look to reports coming from non-governmental organisations, because organisations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have commended the IDF for their notification system, while at the same time stating that often there has been insufficient warning given and that there is no safe place for civilians in Gaza. So that does make it really problematic, because you can be compliant with the law and yet the objects of the law that are meant to be protected may have no meaningful way to actually take advantage of it. And the issue of human shields more generally is problematic. Now, and again, this is for both sides. Under IHL, parties to a conflict are absolutely prohibited from using human shields. You have to take steps to avoid civilians under your control placing themselves in proximity to military objectives. So if I suddenly were to seize control of Australia, if someone decided to chain themselves to Richmond Air Force Base in order to prevent an attack, it would be my responsibility to make sure that didn't happen and to remove them, because you're supposed to protect civilians under your care. However, if civilians insist on remaining in areas that may be targeted, it ends up being lose-lose for all parties concerned, regardless of whatever their intentions are, because the targeting party loses. Because if they go ahead with a strike against a genuinely lawful target, they're going to be killing civilians, and they're probably going to be killing civilians on CNN. The party to the conflict being attacked also loses, because their own people are going to be killed, even if they have attempted to stop such persons from putting themselves in danger. And unfortunately, I think the lose-lose scenario is an apt metaphor for everything that's been happening in Gaza. There are no winners here. No one comes out of this well in any way. What happens from here is unclear. As Catherine and Anthony have mentioned, the current ceasefire does seem to be holding. The UN announced that it has commissioned experts to look into violations of IHL committed by both sides, and the report for that is expected in 2015. Now, Palestinian officials have apparently been investigating whether a new application to join the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court would be successful, following a previous unsuccessful attempt in 2008. As such, we will have to wait and see what comes of these measures. Thank you.
Thank you to the panellists. So it was an outrageous request to ask 3 experts in their field to speak about the Israel-Palestine problem in 15 minutes each. But the reason why the organisers decided to do that was because we wanted to allow ample time for you, the people, to ask questions and to make comments. You don't have to frame anything you want to say necessarily in a question directed to a member of the panel, but you can do that as well if you would like. So we open the floor now to questions and comments from you. Nicholas.
I guess I don't want to go into the Gaza or the Israel versus Palestine issue. I want to address my question to the last speaker, and I guess I'd like to hear what the rest of you think. You know, war, the concept of war embedded in the IHL normative framework is a concept of war that is not embodied in the world we live in. And the kind of war that, for example, we have witnessed is not war in the sense in which all of the norms you've described would be applicable to it. It's really, it seems to me conceptually, not just normatively, conceptually, a mess. IHL is conceptually a mess because it's trying to provide rules for the kind of warfare that is not the warfare that we are witnessing in Gaza and have been witnessing for decades since the Algerian War. So I'm wondering, you know, what is the thinking behind that such that lawyers would try to apply that to a case like this? I mean, what is that about? When we're not dealing with a phenomenon to which the law, international humanitarian law, could in any way coincide or correspond. The second part of my question is about international law itself, and this is obviously not something we're going to get very far with, but I do want to bring it out because it impinges on the first part of my question, and that is, what kind of law is international law? All law that we know and live under, constitutional law, criminal law, etc., traffic laws, have a certain status and a certain legitimacy, and they're also all enforceable. But international law seems to be a kind of law for which there is no clear answer as to its status as law, because it's not law created in the way the constitutions are created and recreated. The law is recreated because there's something in liberal democracies anyway, there's a kind of internal relation between democracy and law. What are we talking about when we're talking about international law? Because one of the things that happens to the very idea of international law after events like this most recent one is people say, what the F is this thing good for? Right?
There, Emily, she has to defend her profession now.
Oh, that's all right. I mean, frankly,
so, I mean, these are less difficult issues than the moral, political issue of what to do about Israel and Palestine. But I think, the lens through which we look at what just happened seems to me a lens that can't be IHL. That is just a completely unhelpful lens. Sorry, I'm putting it in that way, but that's.
No, that's fine, because, if international law isn't law, I'm getting paid for doing nothing. That's fantastic.
Lots of people get paid to do nothing.
Look, the
sometimes really well.
International law isn't law debate has happened for centuries, and it would take hours to actually kind of have that debate. And more to the point, the question is, when people ask me that question, I always want to know the degree to which they actually want to be convinced otherwise. Because all of my students who come to me to do international law resist the idea of international law being law, because it's not like criminal law. You don't throw a state in jail. You don't handcuff Benin when it fails to observe a treaty. So I can understand a lot of people's frustration when they say international law doesn't work and what the hell are we actually doing with it. The only thing I would say to that is the thing I say to my students, which is hands up here anyone who's ever bought anything on Amazon. Because what brings that book from the slave halls of Seattle, or wherever Amazon are keeping their warehouses lately, to Australia is international law. What allows the plane to take off from America, cross the Pacific and land safely in Australia is international law. Now, it may not be law as we understand it as an enforceable system which is top down and has someone who's going to arrest you if you fail to observe it.
But we're talking about international law that is about rights, not about commerce. That's
well,
very
but the thing
different.
is that what allows you to sign a treaty with another country that allows the aircraft to land is about enforcing a right. Because if, say for instance, we have under international aviation law agreements with all these other countries that allow their planes to land in our territory. If they break those rules, we can stop them from landing in our territory. That to me sounds like an enforced right. But I'm not a legal philosopher, and I'm actually not here to debate whether international law is law. I'm going to go back to your question about IHL seeming to be an anomaly in the way wars are fought now. That's absolutely true. The kinds of wars that are being fought nowadays are of a scope and a degree and a quality that the founders of modern international law in Geneva could never have possibly imagined. They never were prepared to accept the idea that non-state groups were going to fight. When they did it incredibly reluctantly. No one foresaw the kinds of technology we're talking about now. That being said, and again, this may come back to the kind of international law is law because people want it to be kind of argument, is IHL is still talked about because armies want it, navies want it, air forces want it, governments sign on to it. And when they see a gap, they go, maybe we should have a treaty about it, and they go and sign it. Now that may sound like a very reductive approach to law, and I know that the guy who taught me law and social theory at UNSW is currently having a heart attack hearing me talk this way. But it's the only way I can understand it to kind of conceive of it, which is if a system of rules is consistently accepted by the group of people who are there to apply it, then it's a system of law. Yes, it gets violated, but research that has been done on both international law generally and IHL more specifically has shown that in 99.9% of cases it is followed. It is only when it gets violated in the most colossally appalling ways, that everyone goes, well, then the system must be screwed. And the parallel that I would draw then would be, well, we have plenty of rules about murder, but people still get murdered in this country. And we don't say that the criminal law doesn't exist as a legal system. We just say that there are people who are always going to break the laws. That doesn't deprive a legal system of its legality because the rules aren't followed. Maybe if the rules aren't followed all the time, you might go, maybe this isn't working so much. But the problem is most of the rules are followed most of the time, and there is actually genuinely empirical evidence to prove that.
From the back, is that a question?
On that note, forgive me, I'm not an academic, but on that note, it seems that Israeli, the IDF in particular, act with real impunity. I mean, before this current conflict in May, 2 Palestinian teenagers were shot dead whilst part of a protest, but they weren't armed and they were walking away from the protest and they were shot dead. It was caught on CCTV. I mean, allow me to ask a very naive question. Who is responsible for making sure that these people are, whoever's committing these crimes, are actually convicted or at least tried? Because for me, as maybe someone who cares deeply about human rights, not from a political standpoint, I don't understand why this isn't looked into, investigated, and it's... Sorry.
Because in that situation, it's not IHL that's the relevant law.
Okay.
Because it's not an armed conflict at that point. When it's an armed conflict, IHL steps in, but that also doesn't mitigate the operation of both domestic legal systems and also things like international human rights law. They can operate at the same time as IHL. But for situations where, for instance, a security force might gun someone down at a protest, that's a domestic legal issue. And that's something that IHL doesn't deal with, basically.
For instance, the kids on the beach, the 4 Palestinian kids, in that scenario?
Well, it would depend on, you'd have to look at the kind of targeting criteria that got used, whether it was deliberate. And if it was, then you look at things like internal disciplinary systems. Because again, IHL as an international legal system doesn't dictate how internal military discipline is to be affected. It just needs to be some kind of investigation. That's in the hands of the IDF, basically. They need to conduct an inquiry. And the bonus, if there can be any such thing in this situation, is that Israel actually has, with their Supreme Court, a very rigorous system whereby Israeli governmental policy can be brought for judicial review. And the Israeli Supreme Court has looked at several occasions on Israeli and IDF policy and has criticised IDF policy for being disproportionate, for being indiscriminate, and for not being accountable. So there is actually a system of accountability. It just comes in a kind of horizontal way rather than kind of vertical top-down. The problem is we don't hear about it as much. It's not to say there aren't situations where there is impunity and where people do seem to get away with stuff, but I would say more specifically that is, people get away with stuff all the time in lots of different areas.
Anthony, do you have something?
Just, I guess, a general comment is that soldiers nowadays may not have a marshal's baton in their backpack, but they'll have a little booklet which says what the rules of engagement are, drawn from Geneva. And so there will be circumstances where the people who are engaged in the conflict will know what they're about. Now, I'm not talking about people being ambushed or something like that when there's heat of conflict, but the boys on the beach, for example, things like that. I suspect that they could be covered by domestic processes the Israeli armed forces should be conducting. And they say, the Israelis have said every time there's been an accusation of attacking a school or whatever, there will be an investigation. Now, the problem there is that these investigations have tended not to be particularly thoroughgoing. But in theory, anyway, there are rules that every member of the armed forces knows they're going to be held account to.
Yep.
Thank you. I may misunderstand, but as I understand it, an occupied country, the occupier is required to reasonably look after the welfare of the people that occupy. Cannot be using resources and such things like that. And the occupied are entitled to use any methods possible to try and even them out. If that's so, how could the Hamas, using rockets, which are pretty damn ineffectual, be accused of war crimes? And I had one other question to go with that, sorry. I'll let it go that.
Come back to it. The law of occupation.
There is no right under the law of occupation to use whatever force to push the occupiers out. There is an obligation on the occupying power to not use the resources of the country, but they are entitled to take measures to ensure the security of their own occupying forces. But there's nothing in the law of occupation that allows people in occupied territory to forcibly resist an occupier. They, no.
Can I, on this point, the Geneva Convention doesn't give the right for the occupied people to fight their occupiers?
No.
I disagree with that. I think that whether the Palestinian territories, as everybody knows, are considered occupied territories. East Jerusalem is occupied. All the countries in the world recognize that. The United Nations recognize that. The settlements are not recognized by any country in the world, and they are illegal, and they should be removed. East Jerusalem is an occupied territory. It's only the first president in the world that Australia or the Attorney General considered it disputed territory, never as before. But I'm pretty sure that Geneva Conventions of 1949 give the right for the occupied people to resist their occupiers.
I would agree with you that the settlements are illegal and they are contrary to the Geneva Conventions with regards to...
And the Palestinian territories are occupied, including Gaza?
The ICJ has actually ruled on that and said yes, absolutely. So that's not disputed, and I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is there are no provisions in Geneva Convention 4 in the Civilians Convention or in the Hague Regulations that give an explicit right to people in occupied territory to forcibly resist an occupying authority.
So what you are saying, any country in the world can go and occupy any other country in the world without any right for these people to resist it?
No, they don't have a right to invade countries. No one has a right to invade countries.
And if that happens,
but
like
if it happens,
what happened in Iraq when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990?
Yeah. Well, that was a use of force question.
What right has the Kuwaiti people?
To resist the Iraqi occupiers, well, there'd be a limited window for them to resist under the definition of a levée en masse. But once the Security Council steps in, and once the Security Council in that case authorised the force to go into Kuwait and expel the Iraqis, that was the relevant law in that case. I don't dispute those kind of issues. I just am saying there is no explicit right in Geneva Convention 4 that allows for forcible resistance to an occupying power. Because in
that case, you are giving the right for anybody to go invade any other country, and you're asking these people to wait for the United Nations to give permission to resist this country.
Well, but if
or
that
to have an international force to expel them, like what happened in Kuwait.
But if that was the case, then states everywhere would be invading other states.
The Palestinians have to wait for something like that.
The problem is that no one wins in this situation, and I'm not saying that international law gives you a right to invade, because it absolutely doesn't. But by the same token, international law doesn't give you the right to forcibly resist. Once someone has occupied, once they're in the position of being an occupying power, you're not allowed to use force to resist, and that's just in the Geneva Conventions. But there might be use of force issues, and that's a separate area. I'm just purely looking at IHL.
Well, from an AHL point of view, which you have given in the lecture, I just think that you have a lot of parallels of Hamas in Gaza, launching rockets, using schools, churches, mosques, whatever. And when the lady mentioned here the impunity of the soldiers and killing these 4 kids, you referred to the investigations by the Israelis, and they said always we want to investigate. Can you give me an example what happened to these hundreds of investigations from 1948 and now? Nothing. Nobody has been indicted. Nobody has done anything for any Israeli soldiers committing all these war crimes. And there is a lot of war crimes from 1948 and now I can't get it. Lately we've got more than about 2,000 civilian people in Gaza have been killed. 80% by the most conservative statistics are civilians. And they have been using, and all the excuses when they from a church, a school, and even handicapped shelter they've been bombarded. And every time the Israelis assume that something has gone through a rocket or somebody has been fighting with it. Do they have any proof or anybody said anything like that? Do we take the Israeli IDF word at face value, and that's the truth? But when we go and say the fact that there's 4 children playing on the beach, nobody is behind, next to them, no rocket launchers, no Hamas fighters, do we have to go and find an investigation by the Israelis, all Israelis? Why don't we have an international investigation about not only these 4 kids, but everything which has gone in Gaza?
Because that's exactly what's happening. There is going to be a UN investigation into it. And the report is going to be July of next year, I believe. So we'll have to wait and see, because they are looking at all allegations or all wrongdoings under the law.
The only thing is that my point here is that the AHL and the international law wanted to know about everything has gone in Gaza, including all the civilians that passed out of the huge civilian casualties, not just concentrating onto Hamas. The Hamas is not 2 million people living in Gaza. These are 2 civilians. And the siege, or the economic siege in Gaza, actually is killing them slowly to death. And from WikiLeaks we know that Israel went to, by having this siege, they wanted to have it on the brink of starvation, and they went even to the limit of calculating the daily calories going into Gaza, so that people, they just don't die from starvation and they don't survive. And this is something which we have to go to look into the international laws and what was all this problem.
Peter or Anthony, do you have any comments?
I've got a question on this, a couple of things that I might add here. We've talked about the legal problems of conducting the war, and although I'm not at all an expert on this, I understand there's a distinction between the jus in bello and jus ad bellum, and that's the question I think you touched on. But without being a legal expert, I'm interested in the status of going to war. But the question that's behind it is not a legal one, it's a political one. Anthony raised the question about the rockets and what else can the government do. That's the talking points that come out of the Israeli government. I don't think anybody, and the Jewish people I argue about this with, could put their hand in their heart and say there was no other solution to the rockets than going in and bombing the shit out of the whole of Gaza, this time or last time. There's no question, this is an empirical debate about what the facts were. The facts I mentioned about that there were no rockets, there was a ceasefire. The safest path for the Israelis is to observe the ceasefire, and the rockets, firstly, it's not a secret, they cause no harm, thank God. I mean, I understand, and I'm happy to concede that the rockets are a crime. There's no question about that. But the idea that this justified, as it was used as a justification last time or this time, it seems to me outrageous, because the facts show that there was no need to invade Gaza and bomb the crap out of the whole country because of the alleged danger, which is not real anyway. So it's